Tonight we address a really important and painful subject, genocide against Christians and other groups in the Middle East as perpetuated by the Islamic State. I'm pleased to introduce Rupert Shortt, who will help us to better understand what's happening there. But first I want to thank Professor Chuck Anderton for arranging the lecture, and thank the W. Arthur Garrity Senior Professorship in Human Nature, which he happens to hold, Ethics and Society, and the Department of Economics and Accounting for co-sponsoring the event. Rupert Shortt is religion editor and Hispanic literature editor at the Times Literary Supplement in the United Kingdom, and a former visiting fellow at Oxford University. He's author of Benedict XVI, published in 2005, Rowan's Rule, the biography of the Archbishop of Canterbury, published in 2009, and Christianophobia, A Faith Under Attack, which was published in 2013, and you'll hear more about that theme, obviously, tonight. In his newest book, God is No Thing, Coherent Christianity, which is published this spring, Shortt argues that despite secularization, the Christian worldview is a much more coherent, progressive body of belief, philosophically, scientifically, and culturally, than many people suppose it to be. He's contributed to British publications such as The Guardian, The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and The Tablet, and to the Madrid-based Revista de Libros. Please join me in welcoming Rupert Shortt.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. It's a delight as well as an honour to be here. I'm not the world's most experienced public speaker, so if I start to mumble at any time, please just raise a hand and I'll do my best to articulate a bit more. I guess we all recognise that a large number of faith groups are persecuted or face discrimination of one kind one kind or another to some degree or another. But in the book that you've just heard about, Christianophobia, I quote figures from the Pew Forum and the World Evangelical Alliance, estimating that 200 million Christians, that's about 10% of the global total, are socially disadvantaged, harassed, or actively oppressed for their beliefs. Exposing and combating the problem ought, in my view, to be a political priority of the highest order, and that it is not tells us quite a lot, I think, about a questionable hierarchy of victimhood. The blind spot displayed by governments and other influential players is causing them to squander a broader opportunity, moreover, because religious freedom isn't just a good thing in itself. It's the canary in the coal mine for human flourishing more generally. There are all sorts of statistics showing a connection between freedom and belief and, for example, rates of GDP, contentment generally, and so forth. I think that a glance at the situation on several continents confirms the picture that I've just sketched. In that enormous belt of the world, for example, between Morocco and Pakistan, there isn't really a single country in which Christians can worship entirely without harassment. Syria used to be an exception, and sadly, of course, Syria is probably just about the epicenter of persecution of Christians these days. And the prognosis for the rest of the Middle East is hardly encouraging. There's now a serious risk, I think, that Christianity will be disappearing from its biblical heartlands in the decades to come. One expert in the UK on various strands of Orthodox Christianity, and Anthony O'Mahony at Heathrop, that's the Jesuit college in London University, estimates that between a half and 2/3 of Christians in the region have left or been killed over the past century. So this isn't a new trend by any means. And as you're probably aware, comparable tragedies have unfolded elsewhere. about 100,000 Catholic civilians in East Timor were murdered by agents of the Suharto regime during the 70s, 80s and 90s, for example. And 2 million Christians and other non-Muslims perished in Sudan's civil conflict between 1985 and 2005 or thereabouts. Christians in parts of Nigeria, of course, live in regular fear of violent attack, and there's clear evidence that such attitudes are fomented through official channels. Now, one reason I think why Christian audiences, or Western audiences rather, hear so little about the oppression in the Muslim world is straightforward. Young Christians in Europe and North America don't become radicalized, and persecuted Christians don't respond with terrorist violence. Another explanation, I think, is linked to blind spots that can affect bien-pensant opinion makers. Parts of the media have been influenced by the logical error that equates criticism of Muslims with racism, and therefore is wrong by definition. And this has further distracted attention away from the hounding of Christians, helping to cement the surprisingly widespread assumption that Christianity is a quote-unquote Western religion. I'm sure you're aware, but many are not, that is very, very far from being anywhere like the truth. But to frame my argument in this way is not at all to endorse any talk of a supposed clash of civilizations, or to pretend that embattled Christians are always blameless, or to deny the immense damage that has been done by Western interference in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia over the years. Christians have obviously displayed great intolerance at times in the past, and continue to do so in certain pockets, including Russia and the Balkans. It should also, I think, be stressed that much of what I term Christianophobia in China, North Korea, among other communist societies, in India, for example, or in mainly Buddhist societies like Sri Lanka and Burma, has nothing to do with militant Islam. But right now, of course, there is a particular problem with the Middle East, which is our particular theme. But before talking specifically about the Middle East, I'd like to just provide a little bit more by way of context, by observing that the oppression of Christians is particularly worthy of note, given the so-called return of religion in recent years. Whether you view this development with relief or unease, it's become increasingly obvious that Christianity and Islam are the two most formidable belief systems on earth. And whatever the extent of secularization in North America or Europe, for example, and even in these regions the evidence is ambiguous as various traditions experience some revivals, almost all societies display high levels of religious belief and practice. The scale of the turnaround has been extraordinary, thanks to the so-called third wave of democratization in the 1970s, as well as smaller waves since then. Millions of people have been enabled to shape their lives in new ways. In country after country, politically empowered groups began to challenge the secular constraints introduced by the first generation of modernizing post-independence leaders. Often, as in communist societies, secular straitjackets had been imposed from on high. In other cases, such as Turkey, India, or Egypt, secularism retained legitimacy because the elites considered it essential to national integration and modernization, and because of the sheer charisma of the country's founding fathers. Think of a figure like Ataturk, for example, or Nehru, or Nasser. In Latin America, right-wing dictatorships, sometimes in cahoots with the Catholic Church, imposed restrictions limiting grassroots religious influences, particularly liberation theology and Protestant sects. Now, as politics liberalized in nations including India, Mexico, Nigeria, Turkey, and Indonesia in the late 1990s, religion's influence on political life increased steeply. And even in the United States, as I understand the situation, evangelicals exercised a growing influence on the Republican Party during the 80s and 90s, partly because the presidential nomination process came to depend more on popular primaries and less on the decisions of party elders. So I think we conclude that nowadays, where political systems reflect people's values, they usually reflect people's strongly held religious beliefs. And this shouldn't really surprise us, I don't think. Atheism feeds off bad religion, especially fundamentalism, whose easily disposable dogmatic certainties now form one of atheism's main assets. On the other hand, it is much harder for atheism to replace the imaginative richness of a mature religious commitment and the corresponding assurance that life is worth living responsibly because it has ultimate meaning. Yet faith is like fire, to quote a sobering analogy. It warms, but it also burns, or can burn. As the Jewish thinker Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the UK and the Commonwealth, and others have pointed out, people used to live in self-contained spaces before the modern era, physically and therefore intellectually. It was possible to believe that our truth was the only truth. That is naturally no longer possible in a globalized world. So while the 20th century was marked by clashes of political ideology, there are strong grounds for thinking that interfaith relations and the politics of identity that they betoken will be one of the dominant challenges of the 21st. And in some ways, of course, harmony between the religions remains a remote goal. Good religion promotes conflict resolution, bad religion fosters discord. As many commentators have pointed out, the destabilizing effects of fanaticism can be seen far from Iraq or Syria and the ruins of the World Trade Center. Formerly secular challenges, such as the confrontation between Israel and the Palestinians, have taken on an overtly religious cast. Many of the fathers of Palestinian nationalism, incidentally, were Christian. Not so now. Religion has played a role in recent and ongoing civil wars in areas ranging from Sri Lanka to Chechnya to Sudan. And along or near the 10th parallel of latitude, north of the equator, between Nigeria and Indonesia and the Philippines, religious fervor and political unrest are mutually reinforcing. This point should be granted even if one accepts religion's status as an immense and maybe the preeminent source of social capital in existence. And on the positive side, of course, faith-based conviction has mobilized millions of people to oppose authoritarian regimes, inaugurate democratic transitions, support human rights, and relieve human suffering. In the 20th century, religious movements helped end colonial rule and ushered in democracy in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. Given the durability of faith, though, we can draw an equally certain lesson for today and tomorrow, that if religions, and especially the six so-called global fellowships, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, if they're not part of the solution, they will almost certainly be part of the problem. This much perhaps is common sense, and another valid inference I would draw is that religious leaders function better as sources of influence at some distance from political leaders, not as wielders of direct power themselves. So, to bring some much needed texture to the discussion, I think we should disentangle fair and tendentious accounts of the terrain and be aware of how it gets hijacked by hotheads at either extreme of the divide between religion and secularism. We've all heard people who, especially maybe after a few beers or maybe even before any alcohol has been taken, will say at the start of a conversation that all of the world's contemporary evils derive from religion. I would say it's above all scientific to single out, quote unquote, religion. Which religion? What manifestation of it for criticism? While ignoring both the colossal violence of 20th century anti-religious regimes, think of communism and fascism, for example, and the strife associated with other forms of social bonding, such as nation and ethnic group. In Northern Ireland, to cite an obvious example, religion is deeply interlaced with the legacies of British imperialism and Irish nationalism. In other parts of the world, religious affiliations often shade into ethnic differences, which in turn merge with claims to land, water, and oil. The 10th parallel is a case in point. Geography forms a major source of tension in several of the countries in this region. So faith differences can be exploited. They can be used as flags of convenience to intensify what are basically turf wars and other geopolitical conflicts. If you look at a country like Nigeria, it has a swampy south, a very arid north, and a fertile central belt. Most Muslims live in the north, most Christians live in the south. There's a big battle for resources in the middle, and there are tribal and ethnic problems, and of course religion in a toxic brew like that becomes one more source of strife. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for those introductory remarks. I felt that they were necessary to try to provide a bit of a map and compass through what I think is a very knotty terrain. Our main question tonight is about genocide, or genocide question mark in the Middle East. And you'll be aware that there's a very specific legal definition of genocide, and it includes the impulse to extinguish an entire culture, as well as to commit mass murder. And I'd like to just talk you through a little spectrum of positions, as I see it, around different countries. If you look at somewhere of huge geopolitical significance like Turkey, I think it's probably not right to use the word oppression or persecution. I think sometimes we can be a bit trigger happy with terms like that. It reminds me of people who say that Christians are persecuted in America or in Europe, which is an opinion that's been put to me when I've done radio phone-ins on stations in this country, and I've been quite keen to resist that. But that's not to suggest for a moment that life for Christians in a country like Turkey is rosy. On the contrary, you are very much a second-class citizen. Everyone has to have their religious affiliation marked on their identity card. If the word Christian is on your card, then there will be a glass ceiling to your career in all sorts of respects. If you're serving in the military, for example, you won't be able to progress beyond a certain rank unless you're a Muslim, and ditto in the police force. Christian schools and other foundations are heavily controlled. In a high school, for example, there must always be a Muslim assistant principal. There must be a mosque more or less next door to every single church. The mosque must be a bigger, taller building than the church. Some of these restrictions are pretty petty as well as harsh. The Turkish government has said that the ecumenical patriarch, that's to say the first among equals among Orthodox leaders in the entire world, the patriarch of Constantinople, that he must be a Turkish citizen. And yet the seminaries have been closed down, so the pool of talent from which to draw Orthodox leaders is very limited. A friend of mine, the travel writer William Dalrymple, told me about 2 journeys he'd made through Turkey in the 1990s. One in the early part of the decade and the other later on in the decade. And when he went back in the late 90s, to his horror, he found that evidence of Christian remains, archaeological crosses, tombs, you name it, had been systematically obliterated by a government with an Islamizing agenda. Sure, they will produce for the benefit of the some foreign observers, for the tourist industry, isolated pockets, pretty little towns, and particularly in the southwest of the country where a lot of tourists go, where you will be able to see a synagogue and a church as well as a mosque. The truth, however, is that it's very hard to be a Christian in Turkey. Not impossible, as I say, and there are a decent number, particularly of the Syrian Orthodox Church as opposed to the Byzantine Orthodox. But I felt a great sense of melancholy, really, when I visited Turkey a few years ago. There's a strongly nationalistic government in power which equates Turkishness very much with being Muslim. I suppose if you're bending over backwards to rehearse the case for the defense, you would say this probably dates back to the 18th century and Peter the Great's imperial project. Russian armies swarm south in a bid to try to reclaim Constantinople for Orthodox Christianity. And this leads to a protracted conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Huge strife, enormous amounts of suffering, population exchanges, the growth of nationalism, people being penalized for not being sufficiently Turkish or Greek or Bulgarian or whatever it might be, leaving a legacy that culminated with the Armenian genocide in the early part of the 20th century and which continues today for the reasons that I've indicated. Now, compare Turkey with the rather fiercer situation that you have in Egypt. 600,000 Christians, 600,000 Copts have left Egypt over the past 30 years. We're talking about a population the size of Boston, to put that into perspective. Why isn't there an outcry about this? It sometimes makes you scratch your head. We're moving from stage one. If we grant that a huge number of Muslims are completely moderate, which I would be among the first to want to do, and that stage two is a kind of Islamist agenda, like the Muslim Brotherhood. Stage three, perhaps Salafism, wanting to ban all sale of alcohol or bikinis or what have you. And stage four, jihadism. Then I think we're very much on the boundary between stages 2 and 3 in Egypt. When I started researching my book, I went to the Coptic church in London and met a doctor who said that he'd been at medical school in Upper Egypt, that's to say in the south of the country, in the 70s. And he said that not a single Christian student was placed in the good, very good, or excellent category. So they knew that there would be a glass ceiling to their career from the word go. But it was worse than that. He said to me that Christians regularly had their rooms trashed on campus. One of his Christian friends was thrown out of his window in his residence, and icons would get regularly trashed. A kerfuffle ensued. Christian students got expelled. The Muslim perpetrators were allowed to stay on. And he blames the militancy to, he ascribes it to, much of the blame for it to President Sadat. After the assassination attempt on Nasser in 1954, this guy told me, by the name of Ibrahim Habib, by the way, many fundamentalists were rounded up and sent to prison. Sadat, faced with heavy challenges from the left, indulged the Islamists and let many in from Saudi Arabia. He also called Egypt a Muslim country, even though 15 to 20% of the population was then Christian. And that figure has now fallen to 12% because of all the immigrants. Now, to cut a long story short, there have been a huge number of really violent attacks on churches and on Christians in Egypt over the past 30 years. Many churches have been firebombed. Christians burnt to death in their homes. And false accusations being made that Christians are trying to convert Muslims. So the situation there is very bad. It probably got even worse under Morsi, so Christians were among those who welcomed the coup of Sisi, the current ruler. But to say that he is a respecter of human rights would be a really colossal understatement. And I wouldn't say that every single human rights organisation supporting the plight of Christians is to be taken completely at face value. Some Christian groups do exaggerate. But if anything in my talk strikes a chord with you and you want to get involved either by donation or spreading the word, then I'd strongly urge you to take a look at Aid to the Church in Need, the Catholic charity in particular. They're based in Germany, meaning that what they do extremely well. They're very responsible, and they produce non-inflammatory reports on the one hand, but they also give practical assistance. They're out there on the ground providing the sacks of food, the logistical support and so forth that is so desperately needed. Particularly, and now I'm turning to my third example, in Iraq. Now, in 1990 there were between 1.2 and 1.4 million Christians in the country. By the time of the Second Gulf War in 2003, that figure had fallen by about 500,000. So it was around the sort of 600,000 mark then. Today, probably many fewer than 200,000 remain. And a sense of the particular horrors being endured by Christians probably began to filter into the Western public consciousness in 2010. This was the moment when 10 al-Qaeda militants staged an attack on the Syrian Catholic cathedral in Baghdad, when over 50 people were murdered and many more maimed as they were worshipping. It's commonly assumed that Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath regime afforded protection to Christians, and although that's true up to a point, I think the idea requires heavy qualification. The truth is that Christians suffered displacement, discrimination, if not outright persecution, throughout the later decades of the 20th century. There were almost 250 Christian villages in northern Iraq at the end of the Second World War, for example. And even by the end of the 60s, dozens of them had been destroyed. The year 2003 sadly marked a watershed, nevertheless. Chaos followed the invasion in the spring of that year, and with chaos came an explosion of sectarian strife, which we all know quite a lot about. Let me see, just skipping through, the systematic desecration of Christian places of worship began with an assault on a church in the northern city of Mosul in 2004. And in the chapter on Iraq, in Christianophobia, I go on to instance one atrocity after another. Beheadings of priests and faithful, the kidnapping of Christians, people receiving bullets in envelopes through their letterboxes, text messages mentioning potential targets by name, burglary and extortion, graffiti, including quotations from the Quran on the walls of Christian homes, and the periodic appearance of armed men outside Christian households. Now, in its latest report, entitled Persecuted and Forgotten, which I think you can read online if you're interested, Aid to the Church in Need talks a good deal about Iraq and Syria, which must be viewed, sadly, as a kind of continuum now. One of the horrific consequences of the past time since the invasion, since the overthrow of Saddam, is that a regional war has developed because the Shia groups of various strands have been enabled to, as it were, join forces. So you have Iran in the east, of course. You have a government with a huge amount of Iranian influence in Iraq, which borders Syria, which is in turn connected to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So on the one hand, right now we have Turkey and Saudi Arabia and their allies representing Sunni Islam, and the alliance that I've just mentioned ranged against them, and it's an extremely disquieting prospect, to put it mildly. Now, in its report, Aid to the Church in Need says, of all the tales of Islamist atrocities, the one which arguably had the most impact was the fall of Mosul and the Nineveh plains to Daesh, or Islamic State, in the summer of 2014. When the Islamist terror group seized Iraq's second city that June, they presented Christians with a choice: either convert to Islam, pay the jizya tax, that's the tax historically paid by non-Muslims in a Muslim-dominated society, or, quote, there is nothing for you except the sword, unquote. When Daesh withdrew the option of paying the jizya tax, almost the entire Christian community fled, leaving nearly all their possessions behind. Hundreds of thousands of others also took flight. The majority of them Muslims. The Christians sought sanctuary in the neighbouring Nineveh plains, only to suffer the same agony again when Daesh invaded many of the towns and villages there. On the 6th of August 2014, another exodus unfolded, affecting Yazidis as well as Christians. Yazidis, you'll perhaps recall, being an ancient monotheistic faith that has if not flourished, at any rate survived in the complicated religious ecology of the Middle East, but now facing extinction themselves. Arriving in Kurdish northern Iraq as morning broke on the 7th of August were 120,000 Christians, most of them with nothing but the clothes that they were wearing. This is 2 summers ago. What happened in Mosul and Nineveh may have had extensive media coverage, but it was only one among many incidents of violence that pushed Christians to the brink as never before. Many faith communities suffered, but with numbers already depleted, Christians had most to lose from the massive surge in Islamist violence. It quickly became clear that Daesh and other militant Islamist groups had trumped al-Qaeda as a force of unparalleled violence. Such ruthlessness was matched only by Daesh's ambition as it set out to create a caliphate, not only extending across Iraq and Syria, but also with a desire to sweep east, perhaps as far as Bangladesh, and west across North Africa and beyond. So, what do we know about the caliphate? Now, this is a respect in which I think we, those of us who are studying theology or have studied it, are reasonably well placed to get inside the mindset of people who are not really understood by secular journalists in general. I've never felt that I was completely able to believe what I was being told on the news. I don't know about the situation in America, but the BBC is a respected organisation, but it's not very strong on religion. And I feel very lucky to have met an American guy in London recently. I don't think you'll have heard of him. He's fairly young, but the point is that he operates mostly in Arabic. He makes TV documentaries about Al-Qaeda and other organisations, and when he's not in London, he's in the Middle East for about half of the year. I work on the Times Literary Supplement, as you've heard, the TLS. Our website is the-tls.co.uk. Look us up, please. We review far more books than the New York Review of Books or the London Review of Books, and we review books in lots of languages, and we will be running a supplement on the Middle East, a special pull-out in 2 weeks' time, kicking off with a major review essay on the caliphate by this guy, Thomas Small, and I was very pleased to be able to read his article in draft before setting off for the States and talking to him. And he points out that a hadith, or a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, considered sound by almost all the major authorities and widely circulated among Sunni Islamists, states that the history of the Ummah, that's to say the worldwide Muslim fellowship, will go through 5 phases. First, the Prophet himself will rule over it and teach it the right way to live. Then will come the time of the caliphate, when caliphs will rule according to the Prophet's teaching. Then will come the time of benign kingship obtained by force, followed by the time of oppressive kingship. Finally, the time of the caliphate will rise again, where a caliph will rule once more in accordance with the Prophet's teachings and usher in the end of the world. What we're talking about is fundamentalist Islamists who in some way bear comparison with the lunatic fringe of Christian fundamentalism, but who are prepared to commit mass murder in contrast to the Christians in pursuit of their goals. Now, from this eschatological perspective, Ataturk's abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1923 marked the end of the third of these 5 phases, the phase of benign kingship. Since then, the Islamic world has been suffering the injustice of oppressive kingship, according to their narrative, whether at the hands of brutal dictators or morally bankrupt monarchs. And though jihadist groups differ over the best way to achieve it, they are united by an ultimate aim, which they share, broadly speaking, with all forms of Islamism: the restoration of the caliphate as a necessary step along the way to the Last Judgment. Now, in 2014, a splinter group from Al-Qaeda achieved this aim, though not before falling out with its parent organization. Having conquered territory on either side of the Iraqi-Syrian border, the Islamic State announced that its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, would henceforth be known as Caliph Ibrahim. And from his base along the Euphrates in the Syrian city of Raqqa, where the most famous Abbasid caliph of them all, Harun al-Rashid, also based his court, moving it there from the fractious Baghdad in AD 796. The caliph and his followers now prepare for the end times, which they believe are imminent, by purifying the world of idolaters and apostates. Just see what a hornet's nest we've stirred up. Military forces from the West. And yet, having said that, it's probably unfair to blame everything on the Western invasion of 13 years ago. In 1990, before the first Gulf War, anti-war campaigners said, you can't expel Saddam from Kuwait, war is barbaric. It's got to be done by sanctions. Well, excuse me, sanctions which are like a medieval siege, sanctions which killed the best part of 1 million women and children during the 90s. I was opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but I have to put my hands up and confess that many strands of opinion about Iraq have just been wrong. You try one thing, it doesn't work. You try another thing, it doesn't work. You go for playing hardball, that doesn't work. You go for softly, that doesn't work. And Thomas said to me in a conversation that he felt that the years of merciless economic sanctions and the Ba'athist tyranny reduced the Iraqis to poverty and despair, and that they had, in large numbers already before 2003, turned to one form of Islamism or another for the answer to their problems by the time the Americans showed up. This means the country was poised to explode when the government America installed after the war failed even to make a start in restoring the prosperity that Iraq had known before the Saddam era. Now, I realize that, first of all, I need to wind up before too long. It'd be great to hear some of your own views. But I feel there's still a little bit of unfinished business, because some of you might be asking yourselves, well, look, is there a problem with Islam as such? And I think that's a question which is as delicate as it is important. Is this a problem with Islam as such, or is it a matter of contingencies? After all, large parts of the Christian world were saturated with unparalleled levels of violence 70 or 100 years ago. I think part of the answer to this question is theological. It's almost certainly true that the idea of jihad is more deeply embedded in Islam than in other world religions, and that therefore Islam is more susceptible to violent extremism because of the martial context within which Islam took root. When I was introduced, you heard that I'd written Rowan Williams's biography, and he for my money is probably the foremost Christian thinker in the world of any background right now. And he's the last person who could ever be accused of Islamophobia. But he did say fairly forthrightly when he was a diocesan bishop in one of his pastoral addresses to his flock. Islam is not an inherently violent religion, but it's a faith which sets enormous store by victory, conceived in quite worldly terms. And it doesn't help that for the first half of the Muslim era, Muslims thought of themselves as being on top culturally and in terms of military power, for perfectly understandable reasons. The Ummah extended from Cordoba in Spain in the west to Baghdad, and in due course to the Far East. A vast belt of land greatly surpassing the reach of Christendom as it happens at that time, and at times threatening to overwhelm it. Let's not forget too that Christ's followers have been extremely violent towards non-Christians and perceived heretics at various times. A guy called Thomas Aikenhead was executed in Scotland for blasphemy as recently as the turn of the 18th century. And this, of course, is to say nothing of the Inquisition, anti-Jewish pogroms that later took place in Christian societies. And nor is Christian-backed violence a thing of the past. In the 70s and 80s, Lebanese Phalangist militias were dominated by Maronites in communion with the See of Rome. And during the 90s, Orthodox Christians and ex-communists who used their religious heritage as a flag of convenience were guilty of extreme aggression towards Muslims and Catholics in the Balkans. As with the Bible, I think selective quotations from the Quran are unlikely to advance the discussion. There are fierce bits of the Quran, there are much more Pacific bits, and I think it's maybe more important to look at the Muslim idea of the concentric understanding of faith, whereby Islam is at the center, Jews and Christians, so-called people of the book, are in an intermediate position. And the representatives of shirk, that's polytheism, and kufr, that's to say those who reject religion out of ingratitude, are on the edge. Now, in Muslim societies, Jews and Christians were traditionally given the status of dhimmis, as I've indicated. They paid a special tax and they enjoyed qualified rights. Now, notwithstanding the inequality of this relationship, and of course its monotheistic bias, it's reasonable to hold that the dhimma arrangement was a precursor to the public international law that would not evolve in Europe until the early 17th century. Christianity's trajectory has been very different. It did not develop a formal understanding of interfaith tolerance, despite the ethics of radical self-giving love set out in the Gospels. Landmarks in the history of Europe, such as the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War, are reminders of how long it took for the principle of toleration to be accepted even between the Christian denominations, let alone between Christians and others. Nevertheless, as an anthropologist I admire greatly in the UK, Jonathan Benthall, has suggested, a guy I'm pleased to say who's been asked to advise the State Department here recently, and he's a very keen student of Islam, and I think a very safe pair of hands in terms of his judgments. Christianity became more self-critical and subversive of its own apparent strictness than Islam. One fruit, Jonathan incidentally isn't a Christian. I think he takes a pretty neutral view of these things. One fruit of Jesus' special emphasis on the poor and the marginalized has been a tradition of positive discrimination in the modern era. So I think you can say maybe that Islamic societies, at least until now, have never been as bad as Christian societies at their worst or as good as Christian societies at their best. The framing of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which was largely the work of Protestants, I think, arose out of intense guilt at Christian collusion in the Holocaust. And obviously Christian societies have become vastly more self-critical and tolerant since the Second World War. It's a shame, I think, that Islam has never developed reform and liberal denominations in the way that Judaism has, but then Judaism, of course, is a much smaller faith grouping, and it's maybe easier for that kind of thing. But Islam is mutating fast, and I would hesitate to be too firm about how it's going to evolve over the time to come. Jonathan Benthall, in the article that I've just been referring to, writes that Islam has proved to be just as flexible as Christianity in accommodating popular forms of belief and practice. Its scholars were able to recognize Hindus as people of the book, apparently, though on the most objective criteria they would have fallen more naturally into the category of shirk. You might think of Hindus as polytheists par excellence, but when a small number of Muslim rulers were in control of a vast population of Hindus during the Mughal Empire, Hindus were, perhaps for reasons of state, bit of theological pragmatism here, they were redesignated people of the book. Well, if that happened in the past, maybe strands of Islam could start displaying similar flexibility. The problem, as I'm sure you're aware, is petrodollars. Saudi Arabia, the seat of Wahhabism, has become vastly richer and more important, and so much more able to export a particular brand of Islam. An analogy, I guess, would be that if you had a fundamentalist Christian sect, I believe there are people in this country who think that, I don't know, the Old Testament should be enacted in statute. So, you know, don't just send people to prison for being gay, but send them to prison for, I don't know, committing adultery or being divorced, that kind of idea. So supposing that such a Christian group were living on an island which suddenly found that it was sitting on the largest supply of oil on the planet, then you get an idea of the parallel with what's happened with Saudi Arabia. So, in conclusion, just as Christianity has evolved, there are some reasonably hopeful grounds, I think, for thinking that Islam will do as well, notwithstanding all the terrible problems right now. It seems right, I think, to finish on an ironic note by emphasizing that the points of contact between the two traditions, they're at least as significant as the differences, in my view. When they are true to their guiding principles, both faiths insist on the sanctity of the person as a seeker of God, and from this should duly follow a recognition of religious freedom as the first of human rights. Whether this awareness will spread or not isn't for me to predict. For the Christian, it's hope and not more malleable impulses towards either optimism or pessimism that really counts. Hope, in St. Augustine's resonant words, has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger that things are the way they are. Courage to make them the way they ought to be. I need to shut up now, I've gone on too long, but thank you very much for your patience. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my book, I try wherever I can to talk about the persecution of Muslims as well. I mean, in India, Muslims are the most oppressed group. And that's hardly surprising, given that there are far more Muslims than Christians. I agree substantially with what you say. I think the fact that so many Egyptians went to work in Saudi Arabia and then picked up Wahhabist views and then brought them back means that there is sadly a reasonably strong theological dimension as well. But you're totally right to say this is about turf wars and other kinds of conflict. And of course the title of this evening's event is about Christians. So that was my main focus. You'll be aware that Copts tend to be better educated, tend to be a bit richer. I mean, that can be a source of resentment. So, but you're quite right to provide that context. Because Jonathan Swift was right. We have enough religion to make us hate one another, and not enough religion to make us love one another. That's the one sentence answer. Christianity and Islam are the two global missionary religions. I said at the start that they're both growing strongly, and the development of the 21st century is likely to hinge on their ability to get on with each other. I hope, as I've indicated, that there are enough resources within both traditions to nourish a respect for the other. I mean, when a particular kind of Christian says, well, it's my duty to go and make disciples of all nations, to convert everybody else, I would say yes, but remember the great commandment as well as the great religion: love your neighbor as yourself. Loving your neighbor as yourself partly entails respect for his or her opinions. And I would also say, remember St. Francis: preach always, and when necessary, use words. I'd also just quickly add that Christians can sometimes be, they're resented with reason. They can be heralds of a more open society. One of the interesting things about China is that they realized about sort of 40 years ago that they were massively behind the West in terms of their development. So they decided that they would start to copy Europe and North America. So it was like, okay, we don't have a market economy, we'll get a market economy, check. We don't have this, so we'll get it, check. We don't have religion. Religion had been notionally completely expunged from Chinese soil as recently as 1970. The Chinese government likes religion to the extent that it breeds docile citizens who work hard and show consideration for their neighbours. They most certainly do not like Christianity when it involves demonstrating against corruption, calling for democratic reform. Christians are loathed in India because they've always, by and large, certainly Western Christians have resolutely opposed the caste system. I often think that the slave trade, unspeakably terrible though it was, is even that horror is put in the shade by the caste system. Let's not forget the caste system has lasted for thousands of years, not for hundreds, and it has involved the systematic degradation of a very significant proportion of the population. And Christians have provided people with a vocabulary for liberating themselves. I mean, it can't come too soon. When I was in India, I went into the deep into the forest and saw, vast numbers of people who will still defecate into the local river and then drink from it and wash themselves in it, are still living in exactly the same conditions that they would have lived in hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And Christians are rocking the boat. Well, a good job too, I'd say. I think I'd disagree slightly with the first part and agree more with the second part of what you're saying. I mean, the Christian world hasn't really faced an existential threat for a number of centuries. It could well be that the balance of economic power in the world is shifting eastwards right now to a position where it was before the voyages of Columbus. The quote-unquote discovery of America provided was one of the big things that provided the West with an enormous impetus, and along came the birth of modernity and the scientific revolution and what have you, and Western economic and military superiority really rocketed from the 15th and 16th centuries onwards. But I think you do put your finger on something very important, which is that Western governments aren't really doing very, very much now, or not as much as they might do. The United States, for example, and my country has neither society has been very generous with Christian refugees, and I'm told that the State Department is rather reluctant to rock the boat, as they would see it, by acknowledging that Christians are suffering particularly badly. And there's I guess it's good in some ways that we are. I mean, if you take a country like Turkey, it's got a very negative attitude towards the outsider. We're very politically correct certainly in Northern Europe. I mean, almost to the extent of being quite self-lacerating. So that there isn't really much sense that there are Christians in the Middle East, let alone that these Christians are facing problems. You just need to sometimes gently point out to people that Christianity is an export from the Middle East and not an import to it, and that so many of these Muslim societies, starting with Egypt, were Christian for centuries, of course, before they became Muslim. And I think it's great that we pay as much attention as we do to the suffering of Muslims or other minorities in Western countries, but it's not a bad thing to pay some attention to one's own traditions as well. If there aren't any more questions, I'd just be really grateful if I could just make a very brief concluding remark, just to pick up on what Tom said, which is that I became very, very fed up by the success of the atheist bestsellers, the turn to new atheism of the past decade. I went to the same high school as Richard Dawkins, had the same biology teacher, and I sent him a polite letter recently saying, I think you can be scientifically literate and come to slightly different conclusions about Christianity. And I bumped into Christopher Hitchens in a restaurant in Washington DC a few months ago, and quite a lot of alcohol was taken, and we put the world to rights. This is just after God Is Not Great had been published, and I resolved that I would produce a very brief book just trying to say in 100 pages how you can be philosophically, scientifically literate, politically progressive, and still go to church without leaving your brain in the porch. And it's been generously received in the UK. It's only just come out in the US, but it hasn't made any kind of impact yet, although I have just had a blog accepted for the First Things website in New York. But if this book should cross any of your radars and you think it's any good, I'd be really grateful if you could spread the word, please. Thank you.